What was missing from the life of the master? The actual experience of a distance from his immediate desires. He could establish such a distance by seeing his mediatory power working through the slave. The master puts the slave between himself and the natural world. The master turns his perspective, basically his values, into commandments, and the slave follows. The slave works on the natural world to make stuff for the master based on those values. The master gets the final production and enjoys seeing his values working in the actual world. The master then doesn't simply get a verbal recognition from the slave, but experiences this recognition by receiving the valuable production, all thanks to the work of the slave. If the master values beauty and pleasure, for instance, he gets a beautiful hut and is surrounded by pleasurable things. And of course, it is the master who decides what counts as pleasurable or beautiful. In the meantime, the slave is, well, screwed. He recognizes the master's viewpoint as the objective viewpoint, without getting any sort of recognition back. The master's desires and values become his first priority, and his own desires and values get suppressed. The master is the apparent winner, and the slave the worst loser of all time. What is better than seizing the absolute power, being a master that can never be wrong? Well, a slave that is sometimes wrong. Let's see why. What exactly is the slave to the master? Not like a brilliantly trained eagle that goes and hunts for his master. That's fun too, but not enough. The eagle cannot turn the natural world into something else based on the commandments of the master. Therefore, the eagle cannot give the master any normative satisfaction. Another human being, the poor slave, could do that because he understands the normative game. He is capable of turning natural world into valuable objects based on what the master takes to be valuable. For instance, turning some random stones to a beautiful statue. He does the job for the satisfaction of the master, not himself, based on values picked by the master, not himself. All he gets is survival. He makes a delicious food for the master, but eats bread and water himself. He makes a majestic bed for the master, but himself sleeps on an uncomfortable bed. As this process goes on, two important things happen. One, the slave gets continuously better at understanding the natural world. As the master commands him to build a beautiful statue, the slave has to learn all sorts of stuff about how the world actually works. The durability of a stone, the art of stone carving, and the general knowledge of physics. Two, he gets progressively better in giving actual existence to valuable objects. The master demands a beautiful statue. The slave has to figure out what that actually means. Part of it is trial and error, making statues and wait for the judgment of the master. If he says it is ugly, it is ugly. The slave has to work on a new one and try to understand what the master really means by beautiful. Moreover, as the slave works on making statues, he also gets better at knowing what actually makes things beautiful. He observes the human figure diligently and possibly discovers something like the golden ratio. Hence, the slave gets persistently better at turning natural stuff into valuable objects through getting better at understanding the mechanics of the world and the perspective of the master. The slave lives a double life. He has his own suppressed desires and the master's desires. He has his unrecognized subjective viewpoint and the master's perspective as the objective reality. The latter functions as the corrective mechanism for him. His actions are all mediated through the master's desires and values. What about the master? He's in the water park, dude. He doesn't give a fuck about anything. He commands and consumes. He is gonna pay for it though. Slave's double life cultivates him. Suppression of his desires and perspective becomes a boot camp for his normative authority. He is forced to focus on a human aspect of himself. In theory, he comes up with a detached viewpoint of some sort, how the world works, no matter what. In practice, he learns how to turn naturally given stuff into valuable objects. By following the master's commandments, he learns how to bridge the natural world and the normative world in reality. He establishes a distance from the immediacy of desires through suppressing his own desires, hello Freud, knowing the external world, and, most importantly, learning the art of turning something natural into something cultural in the most basic sense. In the meantime, the master not only becomes dependent on the slave's perspective when it comes to the knowledge of the world, but also in knowing what it actually takes to put normative authority into action. The master's viewpoint, which was supposed to grant him the distance from the immediate desires through his absolute normative authority, becomes progressively insignificant. The commandments come from the master, but that doesn't grant him any normative authority. Take this example to see why. Let's say the master is in charge of inventing a language, grammar, words, you name it. He forces the slave to learn his language and write beautiful poems. The slave has to work on the language, so to speak, to come up with beautiful poems. The master sits there and enjoys the final work of the slave. Yet, he doesn't get to learn the art of turning some random words into meaningful poems. The master could change the language completely. Doesn't matter. The slave knows the craft. He has learned the art of receiving soulless words and turning them into meaningful poems, indifferent to the given source. In the meantime, all the master gets is the consumption of the final product, enjoying the poem, without actually experiencing the value-giving process, being a poet. The slave gains the authority over the given language, despite his external limitations. The given language is equivalent to normative commandments coming from the master. The poem is equivalent to the valuable object the slave makes to give shape to the given normative commandments. Just as the slave gains authority over the given language in our example, he gains normative authority by learning the art of value giving based on any normative commandments. The mastery of the master, then, turns out to be a contingent material condition instead of a normative one. The slave could remain physically in chain, but normatively he is not. The master could keep the external chain of authority, but that doesn't give him his desired normative authority. In a weird way, the master is working against his own benefit if he maintains the master-slave structure. The slave is the one making the desired progress, distancing himself from the immediacy of desires through learning the art of value giving irrelevant to his own desires and based on a given principle. The fact that such principle came from the master was just an external restriction, not a real obstacle for his normative authority. The master could not infringe his inner freedom, his value-giving capacity through physical and intellectual work. The main lesson of the master-slave dialectic is this: it is impossible to reduce normativity, the question concerning the proper value standard, to a power game with a master who enforces all the values and a slave who follows the normative commandments and gives all the recognition without receiving any. This structure fails because the master becomes normatively feeble over time, while the slave learns the art of enforcing values in real life, indifferent to the source of the normative commandments. The master becomes dependent on the slave's perspective against his initial intention. The slave realizes the significance of his work in giving value to things, turning the mastery of the master into a merely contingent material fact. Suppression of desires, development of a quasi-objective viewpoint through dealing with nature and the master, and learning the art of value giving sets the slave normatively free, giving him the initially desired distance, while the master only trades the immediacy of desires with the immediacy of consumption. Although the master-slave dialectic is mainly a conceptual pattern, it also has important historical relevance. To be sure, the dialectic doesn't say that every master-slave relationship in real life automatically evolves like this. The slaves, for instance, might focus only on overthrowing the masters and taking their place. Either side could lack some intellectual capacity to learn the lesson of the dialectic, and so on. Nevertheless, no matter what happens in real life, the master doesn't gain normative authority by remaining a master, and the slave has the potential to take the conception of normative authority to the next level. This takes us to the historical relevance of the dialectic, because the ancient Greeks and Romans actually got the lesson. They invented Stoicism. Stoicism represents the inner freedom discovered by the slave in the dialectic, appealed to both masters and slaves of the ancient times. Stoicism has gained immense popularity in our times as well. The tech entrepreneurs and military people alike. It is in the next video that we will see how the ancients and moderns, with the inner freedom in their hands, ultimately fall into the unnerving well of uncertainty. Fellows, if you enjoyed this video, please give me this and do that. If you're interested in my channel, let your generous soul loose and help me out by following the link in the description. Thanks.